بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. الحمد لله. In our lessons on Mukhtasar al-Quduri, in the section on transactions, on mu'amalat, we completed looking at the chapter on salam, right? On this very specific type of permissible forward contract, and we looked at the conditions and the reason for the salam contract having very stringent conditions is that the basis is that you cannot sell something that doesn't exist. That's the general principle. And that's why the exceptions here are of significance. They're of significance. And we've avoided going to too many of the contemporary issues that arise that are related to this, but they exist, and some of them, for example, you can find in Islamic Finance, an introduction by Mufti Taqi Usmani, for example. But this is the core concept. We of course understand from things like the chapter on, the chapters on transactions, the importance on clarity in transaction, right? Of clarity in transaction, right? And to avoid those things that lead to dispute. Also, this clarity in transactions also has many wisdoms. One, it avoids dispute, but it also facilitates economic justice. Right? Why? Because who benefits from complex contracts? The common person or the wealthy person? The wealthy person. Because the contracts are so complicated. I have a friend who works in a particular area, a type of, that's associated with the recycling industry. Right? And there's so much regulatory complication when it comes to dealing with recycled items of a certain part, that he said, I can't even get into bidding for it from the government. And the government should be facilitating things for the common person, because the wealthy are already wealthy. So he said, I can't. I asked him, how come, recycling doesn't handle a lot of it by the government in his jurisdiction? He said, I can't even dream of the contract. Because there's so many papers. But a person who serves as a mentor for him in the same field that he's in, and that guy has several warehouses that he deals with, he can't bid for the contract because he did it once. He had to let most of his staff just work on doing the paperwork. Right? And that's what, and this is a big problem, but it's part of how corporations create complexity. Right? There's a very simple transaction. I don't get involved in Islamic finance as an industry. One of the few times I did, and the investment wing of the Malaysian government was buying an American halal meat company. It's very simple. The basic contract, you have to define it. A Malaysian investor is buying 100% this American halal meat company for 2 payments. 20 million upfront, 20 million due in a year's time. That's it. That's all there is to the contract. 100% ownership. How big do you think the contract was for this purchase? Guess how many pages? You know anything about contracts?
No, but you told me before.
Someone pays attention at least. It's 1,600 pages. It's ridiculous. I felt really guilty because we had to read through the whole thing. I felt really bad because the main person going through it was my senior partner, Shaykh Taha Abdul Basir. He told me, where to look in the document, but I kind of breezed through most of the page. I did it on PDF. I wasn't going to print 1,600 pages because fear of wife. It's ridiculous. And the contract didn't finish. And the Malaysians, they ended up not buying it, but they paid us in full. Right? And apologized for wasting our time. I said, if you want to pay me that much, waste my time, whatever. No, actually, I said, last time I'm going to do something so pointless. I don't care how much you get paid for it. Because we built, and it came at a fortunate time because we were totally broke. So I'm never going to do this. I don't care if I'm broke. But the total cost of just reading the documents between a few of us was $32,000 or something crazy like that. Now, who can afford that? That kind of thing, except people who have money, like, the Malaysian government, their investment wing. So these kinds of things, and similarly with other contracts, and this designed in a way that it's meant to skew the system in favor of the wealthy, right? And that's why the value of simplicity, clarity, and definition, right, is very, very important. That's why in legal writing, there's a movement in the West, but there's resistance from corporations and stuff called legal writing in plain English to avoid this kind of things, because it's inherently, there's many things. It leads to dispute, but also it's inherently unjust, right? I have a friend, actually, now he works with Seekers, was working in one of the Islamic banks in Pakistan, and we're looking at some contracts that they have. Couldn't understand head or tail of the English in the contract. And my English isn't bad. Like, I know a little bit of legal contracts. So I asked him, what's the problem? He told me to go talk to so-and-so. So I went to this guy. And someone I gotten to know when I was in Pakistan, he says, sir, it's very simple. He says, we write the contracts in a way that nobody can understand. So we have a legal team. The judge doesn't understand it. The other party doesn't understand it. So if the thing goes to court, the judge will say, what is this contract about? And we get to tell the story, because we come more prepared than the customer. And the customer doesn't understand it, because we can have our way with the customer. So I said, do you understand it? He said, no, we try to put it in the most complicated language possible. It literally makes no sense. I tried to actually use some principle, how you diagram a sentence, etc. It's going in circles. Like 12-line sentence. Right? And this is wrong. Right? This is wrong. And it's a mafsada shar'iyya. Right? Right? So anyway, that's a public service announcement. Now we'll start the class itself. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Allahumma faqihna fi din wa alimna ta'wil wa alhimna rushdana ya Rabbil Alameen. قال الإمام القدوري رحمه الله تعالى ويجوز البيع الكلب والفهد والسباع. It is permitted to sell dogs. And what's a fahad? What? No. Right? 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 And a cheetah, or fahad is used for more than one animal classically. Okay, but wasiba, and predatory animals. And predatory animals or wild animals, the exception being pigs, because pigs are najis al-ayn. Now, a dog, what's the problem with selling a dog? Is that you cannot own a dog as a pet. Right? But a dog has permissible usages, such as what? Hunting, shepherding, as a guard dog, right? In our times, a blind dog, that's also a consideration, right? So the fact that it's not permissible in one way, someone's buying. So if you're selling a dog, the person could be using it for permissible use as well, right? And the general principle is that anything that has a permissible use is not impermissible to sell, right? So that would apply to the dog. Likewise, the wild animal, right? Someone could keep it, one could buy it in order to free it, right? It's being held in captivity, you buy it in order to free it. You're keeping it for, in a permissible kind of zoo. I don't go to zoos, and the kids have been going to zoos for years. I've never gone with them on principle, right? I've never gone to the aquarium on principle, right? I used to actually be part of you have to learn how to lose battles when you're married. But growing up, I was part of Friends of the Earth and was part of a campaign in Spain against zoos. It runs in the family. My cousin runs Pakistan Animal Welfare Society, and I sort of cheer on her hard efforts. But it is theoretically possible that there be a permissible zoo or a nature reserve, etc. Someone could also buy cheetahs for the purpose of their skins, if it were done in an ethical way, etc., which is not prevalent with wild game, but it's put, as if there weren't risk of extinction and unethical practices in acquisition, etc. The fatwa would be that things like this are very dangerous, but there are conceivably permissible ways of some animal that is abundant for it to be used for its skins, for example. Right? Likewise with the monkey, the qird. Right? In many parts of the Muslim world, they used to use monkeys for a tamaskhur, I think it's mentioned, right? Right? And the ulama said that a tamaskhur, maskhara is, they have in many places, and growing up, they walk down the street with a monkey, and you pay a little bit, and they do these tricks, etc. They say, one, it's a waste of time, and number two, it's ta'deeb al-hayawan. It's inevitably, the general is considered to be unjust to animals. But there would be but something whose primary or frequent use is impermissible would be disliked, right? So can you conceive, for example, of selling a poodle as a guard dog? Unless it does fulfill some interest, right? It barks louder than other dogs or whatever, right? So there's, without return to niyyah. But that which is frequently has impermissible uses would be somewhat disliked, but still not prohibited, as long as it has some permissible usage. Right? So, in summary, things that have an aspect of impermissibility, but they do have permissible usage, are permissible to sell and are permissible to buy. But where the primary use is impermissible, or the overwhelming use is impermissible, then if the overwhelming use is impermissible, it will be prohibitively disliked. So, for example, a Spanish guitar. The predominant opinion the relied upon position is musical instruments are not permissible, although there are minority opinions to the contrary, but let's leave those aside. A Spanish guitar has a flat back. Let's say you have a cockroach problem. You go buy a Spanish guitar. He said, my intention is to efficiently squash cockroaches with it. It would still be makruh to buy it. Why? The overwhelming primary use of the Spanish guitar is impermissible. So that would not be permissible to buy on the relied upon position. Someone buys a piano, says, I need a table in my living room. Can you buy any other kind of table? Because the overwhelming primary use of it is impermissibility. So that it would be makruh tahriman. Something that has an obvious primary usage that is permissible to sell. Right? And one of with animals, all animals can one primary use is their skin. You can use their skin, and historically this was very significant because that's animal skins were one of the ways people kept warm in winter, for example, or they insulated their homes, etc. Anyways, and then he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ بَيْعُ الْخَمْرِ وَالْخِنْزِيرِ. It is not permissible to sell wine or pork. Wine because it's najis, right? It's najis, and likewise the khinzir, and the pig is not permitted to benefit from in any part of the pig, right? And here there's a principle, right? And it's mentioned in the Ashbah of Ibn Nujaym that يعني ما The principle is, I'm just writing it out to rejog my own memory. لا يجوز ما لا يجوز استعماله لا يجوز إعطاؤه. Anything that is not permitted for you to benefit from, it is not permitted for you to give to another. Anything that's not permitted for you to benefit from, ولو من وجه, even if it be in a secondary way, but it has an obvious permissible usage. Right? So something that you cannot use yourself. Right? So someone, for example, is it permissible for you to acquire a statue of a human being? No. Say, okay, no, I didn't buy it to put up I bought it to scratch my back. Because there's a picture of Napoleon pointing his finger or something. It's very useful to reach the middle of my back. Is that, to buy a back scratcher? Is that a primary use for a statue? No. So you can. So something that's not permitted to use, even if in a obvious secondary use, right? An example of an obvious secondary use would be, let's say, someone, actually, as I asked this question, they're feeling so embarrassed that it's not a big deal. They find most types of men's underwear to be uncomfortable. So they found these highly inappropriate sports shorts. It says, can I wear them as replacement underwear? So yeah, there's no issue. You could buy it because it has a permissible primary use. You wear it under other clothing, it's fine. Or you want to wear it in the shower to cover at least your very basic aura, it's fine, right? So it's obvious use. Yeah, clothing you can layer clothing, right? Like nobody's allowed to go outside like in their underwear, male or female, as a Muslim, right? So, but it doesn't make buying underwear impermissible because you wear it under other clothing. Likewise, other things. So this is an important principle, that whatever is not permissible to use is not permissible to give. And from this, what's called in English called a fortiori reasoning, bil awla, if you can't give it to someone, you can't sell it to them either. So, so this applies to many, many things, right? So, wine, for example, there's no permissible use for wine for a Muslim, right? Now, what about, so we'll leave that on, and there's issues related to these matters that you can find them in the answer service, etc. if you have questions, right? Then there's a matter where there's difference of opinion, and the fatwa here is on the opinion of Muhammad ibn Hassan. He says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ بَيْعُ دُودِ الْقَزِّ إلا أن يكون مع القز. So this is the position of Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf. That it's not permitted to sell silkworms unless it is with some silk. Meaning the silk, or like the silk cocoon or whatever it's called, because it's as if you're buying that and the worms come with it. Which is, why? Because worms are not are not considered permissible on their own to sell. Now, part of what they say is during earlier times, people were very cautious, so that if you told them the cautious way of doing things, they would do it. But when lack of caution or laxity spreads, then you have to consider, is there a different way of analyzing it? Because the basis is that you can't sell pests and insects, right? But Imam Muhammad said it's permissible because while they're not in themselves permitted to sell, just general, it's a pest. But here, this is a means to something permissible, which is the making of silk. Of course, you have to be exceedingly careful about silk, because most silk in the world is produced in highly unethical ways. You can put it a default. If you buy something silk, you can assume that you're buying something where living creatures were tortured. Pretty much anywhere in the world. Predominant practice is that they're acquired in highly unethical ways. And you say, well, I buy it from a traditional manufacturer. That traditional manufacturer, the nature of the textile industry is most, things, this, are, with the reality of globalization and prices, etc. Yeah, they may be in some rural village somewhere, but they're getting their thread from other places, right? And so that's one of the things to be very careful about. If it's ethically sourced, right? With silk. Of course, men aren't allowed to use to wear silk, but it's important to be very, very careful about such matters, because so the fatwa here is on the opinion of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, because of the app. Because of ta'amulun nas, because of the people's practice, right? Which is one of the reasons one would leave the position of Abu Hanifa. There's a typo in at least my copy, where it says at the bottom of the page, it says وَكَذَا قَالَ صَدْرُ الشَّهِيدِ فِي, it should be في وقائعه. There's an unnecessary alif. Do you have that? What do you have? في واقعاته. Yeah. في واقعاته. Yeah, that's the correction. في واقعاته. Okay, so there's a typo. It's not waqa. It's not waqi. There's a ta missing, basically. Waqi'atihi. Okay. And then ولا النخل إلا مع الكوارات. It's not permissible to sell bees except with their hives. Again, this is the position of Abu Hanifa on that bees too are they're considered a type of insect, and insects and other pests are not allowed to sell, right? However, the answer to that is, that's theoretically true. The cautious thing is that if you're buying bees, to buy them with their hives, even if, the bees are a lot and the hive is just a token, but people left the way of caution. So the fatwa would be but the fatwa is the position, again, of Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan, like the reasoning with the silkworms, because it's a matter. Now, you see Abu Hanifa's caution here, in that what is the definition of mal, of an item of value? It's something that people consider to be of value, right? But, so why wouldn't silkworms be allowed? Because in general, the lawgiver, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has not permitted dealing with, buying and selling using what's called hawam, like critters. You can't eat them. What can you do with a critter? Right? So that general principle and the idea of caution in buying and selling. Do you want to get it with something else. That's theoretically true. But there isn't but why would you leave that position of Imam Abu Hanifa? Because this is understood from the general principles of the Sharia. There isn't a there's no hadith, do not sell. Because if there was a direct hadith, there'd be no difference of opinion. Right? There's no direct, clear prohibition regarding this. Right? So Imam Abu Hanifa's analysis is cautious. But but the fuqaha would leave that. Why? Because there's no clear text prohibiting it. It's based on a general principle of the basis of pests, critters, whatever you want to call them, is impermissibility of use, and therefore impermissibility of giving, therefore impermissibility of selling. Muhammad al-Hasan looked at it differently. No, there is a permissible use in this case, which is use the bees for honey, this, that, the other. Abu Hanifa would say, yeah, but the honey doesn't come from the bee, it comes from the hive. So sell the bees with the hive. And that is the caution. Yani? So, yani? Right? So the fatwa is on the position of Imam Muhammad that it's allowed, but it is more cautious to sell it with the hive, especially if someone's buying it in large quantities, because you're going to need the hive anyways. So it's much closer to caution. And likewise, if the bees are sold with honey, so you want to buy the bees, sell them with some honey. Just get out of the difference of opinion. So, this issue of what is not permitted to use is not permitted to give, nor to sell. This has, just before we move on, has a number of other important applications. Amongst them, for example, if someone is, there's a general rule. There may be an exceptional circumstance, they may seek a fatwa themselves, but for example, if someone started practicing and they have, a collection of, because now people have digital, they have digital records and the digital playlists that they have rights to, etc. But let's say someone has a collection of DVDs, for example, or CDs of music or videos that are impermissible. Is this something that's permissible? So this principle is very useful. ما لا يجوز استعماله, something that's not permissible for you to use is not permissible for you to give. Now, if there's reasonable khilaf on something, someone has a collection of classical music, for example, right? There is khilaf about it. Nobody would say that most contemporary popular music is permissible, right? It would be hard to find things that would be subject to khilaf. But still it remains from both taqwa and the fullness of someone's repentance, not to sell it. That as a thing of leaving behind the past and its traces. That's much better. Unless someone has huge, because there's cases someone has a huge collection of something, etc. One has to see you're selling it to someone else, they're going to harm themselves. We don't want harm even for anybody, whether a Muslim or a non-Muslim, right? So now, if it's impermissible food, so you picked up, let's say someone went shopping and they're distracted because they're talking on the phone. They like Spanish grape juice, right? It's called mosto, right? Or one of the names for it, right? They thought they're picking up Spanish grape juice and they wanted to get baked beans. They want to relive their childhood. But instead they picked up a bottle of wine and baked beans with ham, with pork or whatever. They came home. Can you drink the wine? No. Can you give it to your neighbor? Right? Can you? Can you eat the baked beans with pork or bacon bits or whatever? No. Can you give them to your neighbor? Of course, the simple thing is just get a refund, right? But let's say you can't. You discovered it weeks later. You just put it in your pantry. Oh my God, now you can't refund it. Can you just give it to the food bank? Can you give wine to the food bank? No. Because what you can't use, you can't give. But there some of the ulama distinguish between two things. That in which there is discernible harm and that in which there isn't discernible harm. You see a difference between the wine and the baked beans with pork bits in it? Right? Because the prohibition of pork, is there discernible harm in the pork? Tangible harm? No. Right? The prohibition of pork is ta'abbudi. You couldn't give it to a Muslim, but there the adab is something in which there is not discernible harm. You could let a non-Muslim take it, but the adab is not to give it to them. How? For example, let's say you go to a food bank. You got two packs of baked beans. And you just go there and say, I have these baked beans. Would you guys take them? You can call them. So you take them and just let them take it. Because there isn't discernible harm in it. As opposed to something where there is discernible harm. You couldn't do that with wine or other alcohol because the harm of that is clear and we're not party to harm. Even with whether with a Muslim or a non-Muslim. We don't assist them in that. And this khilaf amongst ulama on this, but this, because it comes up. But it's best, things like that don't happen all the time. It's best to consult to confirm that one's doing things right. Yeah. And we will see some of the issues related to halal and haram, related to these kinds of matters, come up when we get to the chapter on ijara, on hire, because a related principle called al-i'anatu ala al-haram, assisting in sin. And a lot of it comes up with issues related to hire. Can a Muslim work at repairing a church? According to many of the other schools of Islamic law, no, because you're assisting them in sin. Can a Muslim deliver wine? According to many of the schools, no. Can a Muslim rent out our multimillionaire young entrepreneur bought a mall with the millions that she's made. She bought a mall, but someone gave her wrong information, and it's not getting rented out. The largest unit, a Hindu group comes. says we want to establish a temple here. And the place is zoned also for religious purpose or whatever, but can you rent out a space for it to be used as a temple? And one thing is, fiqh is subtle. So always check. Of course, if you have a choice, then generally, if you could choose what repair contracts you would engage in, would you repair a church? If you had a choice, no. If you had an option, but it would be disliked, because when you're repairing a church, what is the work you're doing? You are doing repair. Is the sin in your work? No. And assisting in sin relates, and just because they're tied together, and it's coming further, but just to have it in mind, the sin related to services is if what you're doing is impermissible, and that's it. If the work you're doing is impermissible. In a line of work, that is impermissible. If it has even primary uses that are impermissible, you're not held accountable for that. So for example, if you work, like if you had a choice between pizza delivery, working for a mainstream pizza company, or a halal company or whatever, you would choose one where you keep away from that. But you work for one of these many delivery services. Do you get to choose what you deliver? No. But the act of delivery, what are you doing? You're delivering something from point A to point B. Did you assist them in choosing the haram? No. Did you tell them to consume it? No. So you're not held responsible for it. Which is why you can work in food delivery, which is now so prevalent. You can work, right? Because you're just delivering one thing. You can work for shipping companies. Many of the things that come to them will be presumably impermissible. Right? And of course, once you deal with fiqh for a while, none of it really surprised. Someone was shocked. Some of the stuff that comes, said like, that's life. Everything haram happens. Right? We hate it, but don't be surprised. This is called dunya. People do all kinds of wacky things. Now, why are you staring at other people's delivery items? Okay? 'Cause in his spare time, you check what some of the things were. Said, let people be. But you're not responsible for that. So can I throw it away? Of course not. It has to be haram. Right? Can you many of these kinds of things, and those things will be coming up in the chapter on hire. But just to connect the two, and there's the principle of assisting in sin, which has to do with both sale and hire, comes up there. So for example, if you're selling, could you sell grapes to someone who will turn them into wine? Yeah. Now, where you can avoid it, it's better to avoid. But you don't always have that luxury. Sometimes apparent caution can be sinful. How? Let's say there's something beyond the current, and I've been praying for this for years, not frequently, but off and on, that there be something more equitable than the current ride companies, right? Where the actual riders actually make better money out of it, because they're not just ways of working; they crush people, right? And because someone was considering it recently, I've been using rides. I've been asking a number of Uber drivers about how much do they make per hour. There's one very colorful Chinese guy who actually tried to sell me on printing for our firm. We had a very nice ride. I've been with him for a few times now. I asked him. He told me, stick to what you're doing. You won't make much money doing this. I said, no, I'm not interested. I was asking for someone else. But let's say you're working for someone else's taxi company, right? Of course, this doesn't apply to the ride services because they're structured as matching services, right? So you can choose what ride you take. But let's say that entrepreneur sister has, a taxi service. You own the taxi service. You hire me to work for you. Okay? Now, as an employee, I'm responsible for taking care of your best interest, right? And unless you allow me not to take rides that I disagree with, let's say I go to get to the airport and someone is carrying a bag that has bottles of alcohol in it. Can I refuse to take that ride? No. It'd be haram for me to refuse to take that ride. Why? Because as a taxi driver there, I am acting on behalf of the company. And by entering into a contract, I have to fulfill the terms of the contract unless it's completely impermissible. And it's not completely impermissible because within Islamic law, one of the major schools, the Hanafi school, does not deem that impermissible. Yes, it's better to avoid, but better to avoid when it's your choice. But by entering into this contract, I have taken upon that I'm acting within reasonable best interests of my employer. So therefore, me to avoid it for personal reasons, I am wronging you. I'm a zalim. Right? I'm a zalim. And that's not allowed. That's something to keep in mind with respect to and we'll be talking about it later. But the issues related to assisting in sin are many. And in some cases, last point on it, some cases, what is a general ruling, so something may be generally disliked, but in a particular context, it may be obligatory. So I have a friend, he came back from studying overseas, and before going overseas study, he used to be in construction. He came back, he was working as an imam in a community, but they're paying him peanuts. And he couldn't survive. So he'd been working like literally as a masjid from over 12 hours a day. And then he was working night shifts at a garage, as a parking lot. But it was hurting his health and his family life because literally he'd be out of the house over 20 hours a day. It's inhumane. So he went back into construction, but 6 months he opened up, he had no contracts. Then he got a contract from a church to repair it. Because one of these hippie churches, nice, so they wanted to work with a Muslim guy to show that we respect, it's nice, we respect diversity and this, that's great. His wife's also learned and personal taqwa said, I'd rather be broke than take haram money. But at the same time, they're on the verge of divorce because he can't pay the bills. Very complicated. So the way he posted, there's no way this could be halal, not? I knew the issue theoretically, but I asked two of my teachers about it. And one of them says, how is his family dealing with this financial difficulty? It's causing them a lot of trouble. Says, tell him, says, you can quote me on this, it may be obligatory for him to take that work. Why? Because in itself, yes, it may be better to avoid. Right? It's makruh in itself, somewhat disliked. But what is the ruling of supporting your family? It's obligatory. You don't support your family by doing the haram, but now, are they going to be patient with you not providing for them? No. Is it going to lead to harm in the marriage? But you can't give yourself a fatwa. That's why you have to go and ask the people of knowledge, right? But for a student of knowledge, you don't just go give a fatwa on your own. You go ask the people of knowledge. Anyway, so those are some related issues to what's here. Then he says, وَأَهْلُ الذِّمَّةِ فِي الْبَيِّعَاتِ كَالْمُسْلِمِينَ. Non-Muslims are like the Muslims when it comes to sales. Right? إلا في الخمر والخنزير خاصة. Okay, so they held to the same standard except for pork and alcohol pork and wine and pork specifically, right? Right? فإن عقدهم على الخمر كعقد المسلم على العصير, because they're transacting in wine is like a Muslim transacting in juice. وعقدهم على الخنزير, and they're transacting in pork or unslaughtered meat, as the commentator says, كعقد المسلم على الشاه, like a Muslim's transacting over cattle. And the same thing applies that which they deem permissible, right? So it's not just in wine and pork, but it's also other وما اعتقدوه حلالا. Right? And this is even if it's just in their social norms, even though that's leaving their religious norms, right? It doesn't have to be that this is in their shara, in the divine guidance they claim to follow, but that this is their umirna natrukahum ma yadinun. We've been commanded to let them be, and what they deem permissible, it's not in their deen, but in their practice. So for example, if they, whatever they buy and sell, the things that they deem permissible to buy and sell, if it's mal, according to them, if it's an item of value, they can buy and sell it. And in a Muslim land, non-Muslims are not prevented from buying and selling anything, even if we would deem it impermissible, unless there's there's broader public harm. And that's one of the things, that's one of the amazing aspects of Muslim societies, that historically non-Muslims were not prevented from buying and selling alcohol, pork, anything else that they deem permissible amongst each other. And likewise in other laws, what kind of marriage relationships or non-marriage relationships they allow amongst themselves within the Muslim society, but you cannot promote that or engage in that with Muslims. That has to be prevented, right? And that's been the case across the great Muslim societies throughout history, right? And so there's been no human civilization as accepting of diversity as Muslims. There's no point of comparison anywhere, right? In their own areas, if they want to walk around naked, we have no objection. Just please don't walk. You can't walk in the Muslim parts of the city naked. You want to walk naked, but in your areas, please. Right? Unless it becomes a problem, right? And unless Muslims go through that area frequently, etc., then we'd say, okay, but you want to pass a law, we want to walk naked, okay. But then if there's throughways where Muslims walk through as well, then please keep away from the throughways without at least covering up, basically, right? Etc. And of course, historically, everybody had at least some sense of dignity, so they didn't do things like that broadly. But if they did, right? And this came up, of course, in many parts like Indonesia, etc., where there's tribes who had these kinds of habits. What do we do with them? Just let them be. We don't hold them responsible for the rulings of Sharia, but said, if you come to the marketplace, etc., then at least they agree on what's a dignified minimum. Right? And then it's respected. We let you be, but at least stay reasonable when you come in contact with us. Right? Okay. And this principle with respect to non-Muslims, right, applies that when it comes to the right, to the rights that they're owed, that the asl is that when it comes to social rights, a non-Muslim has all the social rights of a Muslim, إلا فيما اختص به المسلم, except in those things that are unique to a Muslim, right? Right. So, for example, when it comes to the rights of the neighbor, the rights of family, it applies to whether it's a Muslim family or non-Muslim family. The rights of the neighbor, it applies to the Muslim family member or the neighbor, Muslim neighbor, and a non-Muslim neighbor. When it comes to the rights and responsibilities of a relationship, right? Because any relationship you have, a co-worker, right? A partner in business, etc. In these, rights and responsibilities arise. Visiting the sick, right? Helping the one in difficulty, distress. If they're poor, assisting those who are poor or hungry or orphaned, etc. In all of these, that when it comes to the social rights, they have the same rights as us, except in the things that are unique. There's some things that are unique, right? Now, some of those social rights, the basis of that charity has always been connected with religion. Charity has always been connected with religion, so that the assumption is that if someone is in need, they would go to their masjid or their church, right? Because charity is historically always been faith driven. Because from a worldly perspective, charity doesn't make much sense, right? Which is why there's a left-wing argument against charity. It actually makes a lot of sense, because if there's no hereafter, why are you giving in charity? Do you want to feel good? Frankly, most people feel good in many other ways, right? And there's back and forth regarding that. Maturidis would not necessarily agree with that entirely, but they say then it's all just for self. Just the Marxist argument against giving charity. We don't, of course, disagree with that firmly, right? And so that's often, we often neglect that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us higher resolve. Last thing on the chapter here, in several places, the author quotes Al-Yanabir, which is one of the commentaries on Quduri, and it's published now, right? And it's worth being aware of, right? The author quotes that. Then you have Kitab al-Sarf. So today we're going to have to stop here because there's something pretty critical that I have to attend to that's just come up. It's generally, but there's some important issues that I really, because the point is not just to rush through things, but to deal with the important stuff that come up. And since we're moving past transactions themselves, now we're towards the things that are sales related. Now we come to sarf, for example, monetary exchange, and then after sarf, we move past it to, I believe it's rahan. Yeah, to rahan, right, which is collateral, and then a guarantor, etc. So it felt it was important to touch upon some of these matters. Now, things like these are important, right? Collateral, etc. Because, and one of the aspects is, and I was only partially joking about the example of people getting into business, because the Prophet ﷺ gave strong encouragement for people to enter into business, right? And to have that financial independence. Someone went to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and said, "What should I do? Like, what line of work should I go into?" And he told him that enter into business. Imam Ahmad didn't like wasting words. He said very intriguing words. He said, there may be a janazah, there may be someone sick, and there may be a janazah. The scholars had a field day explaining what he meant, in that if you're working for yourself, you'll have that independence. That you want to attend a class, you can structure your work, etc., in a way that you can attend the class. But or the social rights and responsibilities. You can attend a funeral, visit someone sick, etc. It gives you that capacity, which you may not have if you're working for somebody else. But also, it's you're much more likely to have. You stand on your own 2 feet and so on. Where Allah facilitates that, and that's one of the ways that so many of the righteous entered into trade. One, because of prophetic encouragement. Number two, because a lot of the righteous got into trade and started their own businesses, or they went into their own crafts, trades, etc. Because they were seeking to be cautious in their dealings. You're trying to be cautious and ethical and upright in the messy world of the marketplace. Then you got to step away from it, right? And that's how they changed the world, to be honest, right? The traders spread Islam all over the place because they were seeking money that was halal and tayyib, right? Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. So my apologies, we need to stop here today. But many of the chapters coming ahead, we are going to go at a slightly faster pace because there's the details of them, like sarf and so on, it's important to understand the text. We're going to try to accelerate in them, rahan, etc., to get to understand the issue, but the details are less important. But in sales and the associate chapters, the details are very, very important. Alhamdulillah. Yeah.